So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. People are going to be coming in, but we want to start on time. We have so much information and discussion to have tonight. Welcome. My name is Michelle Chalmers. I am representing the world of Wellesley, along with my fellow board members who are here, if they would raise their hands so everyone can see. Yay! There's Sajida in the front. So I have a lot of wonderful women helping this evening. So we have obviously registration and then the books for sale in the back, and we'll also hopefully save some time for Chuck and Richard to sign books if you brought them, if you had already had them, because you are part of the third annual World of Wellesley Community Read. This is a very exciting event that the World of Wellesley started about 3 years ago. We got the idea from the library, thought it was a great idea to be able to invite the community and our neighbors to read a common book together and then hold a book talk with your organization or your group or friends, and then come to an author visit. So if anyone is familiar and has been on our track for 3 years, we started with Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. And then last year we had Chuck Collins, who is the author of Born on Third Base. A one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. It's an amazing book, and we had Chuck here last year in this very room for an author visit. And so now tonight we are very, very excited for our third choice of books, The Color of Law, the history of how the government segregated America by Richard Rothstein. So we're very excited that everyone is here this evening. We hope that you learn more about the world of Wellesley. If you're not familiar, we do have some booklets in the back, our website, worldofwellesley.org. We'd love to keep you on our mailing list for other events that we do throughout the year. And so this evening, what we're going to do is I am going to introduce author Chuck Collins, who will be our moderator for the evening. And we're very thankful that he accepted our invitation to do that this evening. How many people were here last year and heard Chuck speak? Excellent. All right, great. Thank you. So Chuck Collins is a senior scholar at the Institute of Policy Studies, where he directs the program on inequality and co-edits inequality.org. I definitely recommend for you to go to the site and sign up on their mailing list. He sends out a weekly information, blog, posts, facts. It's really a wealth of knowledge about the work that he and his group is doing at inequality.org. We talked about his newest book. If you haven't read Born on Third Base, please do. He is also the co-author with Bill Gates Sr. of Wealth in Our Commonwealth, Why American Should Tax Accumulated Fortunes. And if you haven't read that book, definitely pick that one up too. So thank you so much for your attention. I am going to welcome Chuck Collins up to moderate the event this evening. He will introduce our wonderful speaker, Richard Rothstein, and then we will do a little bit of pair sharing, and Chuck and Richard will have a conversation together, and then we will open it up for comments and dialogue. So thank you so much, and Chuck, welcome, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, and the team, the board, volunteer board of World of Wellesley, and the extraordinary work you're doing to sort of help transform and make Wellesley a welcoming community to all. And as Michelle said, we're going to hear from Richard, a substantial talk from him. We'll have a chance to reflect a little bit in pairs or small groups. Richard and I will have a brief chat, and then we'll move to kind of an open question format. So we are very honored this evening to have Richard Rothstein here, author of this new book, The Color of Law, which is causing a real sensation. People are reading it, talking about it. He's here in the Boston area. He was at Harvard Law School today. He's with the Mass Community Bankers Association tomorrow. He came all the way from Berkeley, California, to be here, and we timed his visit to land perfectly between nor'easters, so he can. But we're The Color of Law is a very important book because it shows how the past, how the legacy of residential segregation shows up in the present, how the past is in the present, how this prior century of de jure legal and public policy enforced government-sanctioned patterns of residential segregation are imprinted on our geography, on our neighborhoods, on our city. So I think Richard is really both helping us understand the history, the story of how we got to where we are, the particular problems that we're struggling with in this moment, and how much of that is still rooted in this history of residential segregation. And I think that Richard also really, in Color of Law, brings to the fore a number of remedies that I think we can all begin to grapple with. So Richard is a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute, which is based in Washington, D.C. He's also a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In addition to The Color of Law, he's written a number of other books about education policy and other issues related to race and education. One of the books I read that I highly recommend is called Class and Schools: Using Social, Economic, and Educational Improvement to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap. So again, I mentioned Richard is with us all the way from Berkeley. He could be there in Berkeley where the flowers are already blooming. In fact, they're blooming pretty much all year round. The trees are green and lush, but he's chosen to come here and be with us. So let's give him a Wellesley welcome.
Thank you very much, Chuck. And thanks to all of you for coming here this evening to engage in this conversation with me. Chuck says that I'm here between nor'easters, so that means you have another one that's coming? Tell us about it. As you all know, this country in the 20th century, we made the decision to abolish racial segregation. We concluded that it was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was actually harmful to both African Americans and to whites, and that it was unconstitutional. It was a violation of our national principles. And beginning in the 1930s, civil rights groups began a campaign to desegregate first law schools. That was the first thing that lawyers in the civil rights movement attacked, because they figured if judges were too stupid to understand anything else, they could figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then they went on, they built on that to desegregate colleges and universities. And then from there, as you all know, they succeeded in winning Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate elementary and secondary schools. And then the civil rights movement began to grow, and the result of that was a series of laws in the 1960s that abolished segregation in lunch counters and buses and water fountains and public accommodations of all kinds. And yet, we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one I've lived in had clearly defined areas where only whites or mostly whites lived, and clearly defined areas where only African Americans or mostly African Americans lived, without exception. Every metropolitan area is residentially segregated, and we all accept it as part of the natural environment. Unlike our commitment to abolish segregation in all of the other areas I talked about, not only have we not succeeded in abolishing residential segregation, we haven't even tried. We accept, as I say, as a part of the natural environment that we're going to live in a nation that's segregated by race. And I think the reason that we do that is not entirely hard to understand. It's a lot harder to desegregate neighborhoods than it is to desegregate the other things I talked about. If we pass a law desegregating water fountains, the next day people can drink from any water fountain. If we abolish segregation in buses, you can sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so in order to avoid taking on this more difficult task, we've adopted a national myth, a rationalization that excuses ourselves from addressing residential segregation as a violation of the Constitution, as an obligation, a constitutional obligation and a moral obligation. We've adopted a national myth. And we've given the national myth a name, and this myth is held by people across the political spectrum, by liberals and conservatives, by whites and blacks. It's pretty universal, and that name is de facto segregation. What we say is, you've all heard this term, right? You know, we say we have de facto segregation in neighborhoods. It's not like the other segregations we abolished. The other segregations we abolished were created by government. They were created by law and regulation and public policy. They were enforced by the state. The residential segregation that we see all around us is not like that. It's de facto. It sort of happened by accident. We tell ourselves it happened because, private people wouldn't sell homes to other race buyers. Or maybe African Americans and whites just happen to like to live with one another of the same race. They don't like to mix. Or maybe private real estate agents or banks happen to discriminate and enforce racial boundaries. Or maybe it's just that black people don't have enough income to move into white neighborhoods, and that's why we've got it. All of these individual private decisions that government has nothing to do with have created the racial boundaries we know. It's sort of accidental segregation. And if it happened by accident, it can only be unhappened by accident. It's not our responsibility to do anything about it. And I used to spend a lot of time, actually most of my time, writing about and analyzing education policy. And I came to understand that we could never solve the educational problems we have in this country so long as we had segregated schools, because when you take children with serious social and economic disadvantages and concentrate them in single schools, it becomes impossible to overcome those disadvantages, to give children special attention if they come to school less prepared than children from better educated homes, or if they come to school drowsy from asthma. You know, African American children have asthma at 4 times the rate, middle class children. If they come to school drowsy or sleepless or maybe even absent from school, it's impossible for teachers and schools to overcome these kinds of social and economic challenges when they're concentrated. When entire schools have where every child either has asthma or comes from a home where parents are poorly educated, or lead poisoning, or stress from parental unemployment or homelessness. You take children like that and you concentrate them in single schools, overcoming those problems becomes impossible. And so I was thinking about that, and we call schools where those children are concentrated, we call them segregated schools. And so I began to wonder why schools are so segregated. And then I read a Supreme Court decision in 2007. It was an education decision. It was a decision about school desegregation. And in 2007, the Supreme Court examined a desegregation plan in 2 school districts. One was Louisville, Kentucky. The other was Seattle, Washington. Both of those districts understood that they could never make the progress they wanted to make if their schools were segregated. So they adopted a choice program where parents and their adolescent children could choose which high school they would go to. But if their choice happened to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of a child's choice that would not exacerbate, that would help to desegregate. So if you had a high school with that was mostly white or all white, and one place was left, and both a black and a white child both applied to it, the black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. And the Supreme Court said that that was a constitutional violation. You couldn't do it. It prohibited the school districts of Louisville and Seattle from this very token plan. It couldn't be a more trivial plan. Most kids don't want to go to high school outside their own neighborhoods and away from their friends. And the cases where you have one place left in a high school and both a black and a white child applied, I mean, it's trivial. But the Supreme Court said it was a violation of the Constitution to do this because it said the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, that's right. I thought that Chief Justice John Roberts was wise in making that observation. It's something that I knew myself, and in fact, schools are more segregated today than at any time in the last 45 years. And they're more segregated today because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. But then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in which the schools are located are segregated because of all these accidental decisions. Government had nothing to do with it. It's de facto segregation, and under his constitutional theory, you cannot take a child's race into account in trying to remedy something that the government had nothing to do with creating. And I remembered after reading this case about a situation I had read about some time before in Louisville, Kentucky. And some of you may know this story. In Louisville, Kentucky in the 1950s, a white middle-class homeowner in the suburb called Shively had an African-American friend, an African-American Navy veteran, a middle-class guy with a good income, had a family, wanted to move to a better housing than he had in urban Louisville, but nobody would sell him a home. So the white homeowner bought another house in his suburb, resold it to the African-American Navy veteran, and when the Navy veteran and his family moved into the home, a mob surrounded the house, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They firebombed and dynamited the home. And when the riot was over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed the white homeowner, the white seller, for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much to me like de facto segregation. And I had known a little bit more about it than that, so I began this investigation, as I say, after reading this case in 2007, to see whether this was some kind of isolated incident of government enforcement of segregation, or whether there was a more consistent pattern. And what I concluded as a result of the research that I've reflected in the book, The Color of Law, is that not only was it not an isolated incident, but that the reason we have racial segregation in every metropolitan area of this country is because of a very racially explicit, unhidden, written public policy enforced by the federal and state and local governments that was explicitly designed to create segregation in every metropolitan area of the country, to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live with one another, near one another. And the policies that the government followed were so interrelated, so mutually reinforcing, and so powerful that they determine the racial boundaries that we have in this country today. And that if we understood this history, we would understand that the racial segregation that we have everywhere in this country is as unconstitutional as segregating water fountains or buses or lunch counters or any of the other less important areas, not that any are unimportant, but less important areas that we desegregated in the mid-20th century. It's as unconstitutional as these other areas, and because it's unconstitutional, we have an obligation, which we have avoided because we've denied the reality of state-sponsored segregation. We have an obligation under our Constitution to remedy it. So let me describe some of the most major policies, the most important policies the government followed to create segregation. I can't describe them all. You'll have to read the book if you want to know many of them, but I'll describe some of the more important ones. Let me begin by talking about public housing. Now, I think all of you think you know, as I thought I knew. I'm not telling you anything that I knew before I did this research either. I think you know, or think you know, what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live. It's a place where lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, engaging in oppositional behavior because of their aimlessness, getting into confrontations with the police, sometimes violent. That's our image of public housing. It's what we all think public housing is. But in fact, public housing in this country began not for poor people and not for minorities. It began as a program mostly for whites, working class families, stable working class families with incomes that could afford rent, but in the Depression there was no housing available. And the government built public housing for families, not for poor people. They weren't admitted. In fact, in the Boston area, the first Boston Housing Authority had social workers who visited the homes of public housing applicants to make sure that their furniture was of high quality, wouldn't lower the standards of public housing. They had to report on whether the children were well behaved. They had to inspect marriage licenses to make sure that there was no hanky-panky going on in public housing. This was middle-class public housing, working-class public housing, created by the federal government during the Depression, when working-class families who did have jobs, not everybody had jobs, but those who did have jobs could afford housing, but there was none available. And everywhere in the country, the federal government, beginning with the Public Works Administration, one of the first New Deal agencies, segregated public housing, building separate projects for whites only, and a few projects for African Americans, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. So in this area, in Boston, the federal government built housing projects in Mission Hill. It built the Mission Hill projects for whites only. It built the Mission Hill East for African Americans only. And this is not because, whites happen to like to live with one another, so they all happen to apply to Mission Hill, and blacks happen to like to live with one another, so they all happen to apply to Mission Hill East. These were explicitly designated projects by race here in Boston, Massachusetts. A newspaper reporter once visited the projects and described the office across the street from the projects where people went to pay their rent. He said there were two lines, two windows, one for Mission Hill, one for Mission Hill East. One line was all white, the other hill was all black. He said you could have been in Alabama, but in fact you were in Massachusetts. In Cambridge, Cambridge was an integrated community in the early, mid-20th century. The Central Square area was about half black and half white. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that area, integrated housing, and built two separate projects. The Newton Courts project was for whites only. The Washington Elms project was for blacks only, explicitly designated, creating a pattern of segregation in Cambridge, which along with the Mission Hill project and others, created segregation in this community that otherwise might never have existed. And remember, we're not talking about poor people. We're talking about working class families. The great African-American novelist and poet and playwright Langston Hughes, I don't know if any of you have read his autobiography, but it's called The Big C. And he describes in his autobiography how he grew up in a neighborhood like Central Square, an integrated neighborhood in downtown Cleveland. As I said, there were many such neighborhoods in the country at that time. We would actually be stunned if we were transported back to the middle and early 20th century to see the extent of urban integration that there was. It's not something that we're in any way familiar with today. Urban neighborhoods were integrated simply because workers didn't have automobiles to get to work. And they had to walk to work, and since most employment was concentrated in downtown areas, they had to be either live close enough to work or else be able to walk or else be able to take short streetcar rides to get there. So if you had an industrial area, warehouses and factories that had African Americans and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants and Jewish immigrants and rural migrants all living in the same, working in the same industrial area, they had to live nearby. The other reason we had integrated neighborhoods in urban areas everywhere in the country, even in the South, Jim Crow segregated lunch counters and water fountains and buses, but it didn't segregate housing. Because even in the South, workers had to live close enough to their workplaces to walk to work, so there were integrated neighborhoods there. Langston Hughes describes how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend was Polish in high school. He dated a Jewish girl. This was not unusual. It wasn't typical, but it wasn't unusual in the early to mid 20th century. But the Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and created separate housing projects for blacks and for whites, creating a pattern of segregation that otherwise hadn't existed. And it helped to determine the future residential patterns in Cleveland. I'll give you one other example in Atlanta, just to illustrate that this also happened in the South, but it wasn't simply a Southern problem or Southern activity. There's an area near downtown Atlanta called the Flats, which was integrated, like the Central Square and the Central neighborhood in Cleveland. It was about half black, half white, not exactly, but roughly 60-40. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and built a housing project, a public housing project for whites only, forcing the African Americans to double up with relatives, to subdivide homes, to find housing where they could in the Atlanta area. This went on all over the country. During World War II, it became even more extreme because during World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production in the war industries to get jobs. There had been high unemployment, as you know, in the Depression. It was World War II and the war industries that brought the country back to full employment. And hundreds of thousands of workers who didn't have jobs or didn't have good jobs flocked to centers of the war production. But they the factories were located in places that couldn't absorb the influx of population. The government had to provide housing for these war workers. I describe in my book a community. I like to talk about places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California, because people think of those as liberal areas, and I want to explain that if it happened there, you can probably imagine it happened everywhere. So I write about a community just north of Berkeley, a suburb of Berkeley called Richmond, California, which was on the San Francisco Bay, and so it had a deep water port, and it was the center of shipbuilding on the West Coast during World War II. The Kaiser shipyards were constructed there. There were no shipyards there before the war. By the end of the war, Kaiser had employed 100,000 people. If you count their spouses and families, you're talking about an influx of maybe 400,000 population, to the town of Richmond, which had a population before the war of about 20,000. How does a community of 20,000 absorb 400,000 in the space of 4 years? It couldn't. If the government wanted those ships to continue rolling off into the bay, it had to find housing for these workers. Richmond itself, I say, 20,000 people. It was an all-white community. There were very few African Americans on the West Coast before World War II. Unlike here in the East, there was no great migration of African Americans during World War I. So this was a white community. It wasn't segregated, obviously, because there weren't any African Americans to segregate. There were a few living on the outskirts of town, working as domestics in white families' homes. These were typically wives of Pullman car porters who were hired by the railroads. The terminus of the Intercontinental Railroad was Oakland. The railroads would only hire African Americans as Pullman car porters, so the community around the terminal was integrated because there were Pullman car porter families living in this broadly white population, and then some of them were living in the outskirts of Richmond, working as domestics in white homes. The federal government built housing for the African American workers along the railroad tracks and in the industrial area near the shipyards. It was temporary housing because the city of Richmond announced that any African Americans who came to Richmond to work in the shipyards during the war would have to leave at the end of the war. They couldn't stay in Richmond after the war. And it built housing for the white migrant workers, stable housing farther inland in the white industrial area. And this again happened everywhere in the country. Everywhere there was segregated housing built by the federal government, either reinforcing patterns of segregation or creating patterns of segregation, as in Richmond, that hadn't existed before. And we have something that the social scientists call an existence proof that shows how unfounded this policy was, how unjustifiable it was, quite aside from its unconstitutionality. There was another shipyard in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Marin City, which is You've heard of the Golden Gate Bridge. It's on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. This shipyard grew so fast that authorities had no time to segregate housing. They just built barracks for single men who were coming to work in the shipyard, and as the men showed up, they handed out pillows and blankets and sent them off to the barracks. They didn't have time to create any segregation. Worked out fine. When the families arrived, the city of Marin built integrated housing for the war workers. It's the only place in the country I know of where they built integrated housing for war workers, and it worked out fine. There was no problems, no reason. The Navy insisted that you had to segregate housing for war workers because it would interfere with production efficiency if whites and blacks lived with one another, even though they were working with one another in the war industries. After World War II, there was also an enormous housing crisis because not only had no housing been built in the Depression, but during the war, during World War II, it was prohibited to use construction materials for civilian purposes. You could build housing for war workers, but not for others. And then after the war, millions of returning war veterans came home needing housing, forming families, having the baby boom, doubling up with relatives. We had a national mothers-in-law crisis because of this heavy concentration, the doubling up, and living in Quonset huts and open fields. President Truman proposed a vast expansion of the national public housing program after the war. And again, we're still talking about, keep in mind, we're still talking about working class families. These were returning war veterans. They had jobs in the post-war boom, but they had no housing available that they could rent. And he proposed this vast expansion of the national housing program, and conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat it. They didn't want to defeat it for racial reasons. It was segregated. They have no objection to that. They didn't want to defeat it because they didn't like poor people. It wasn't for poor people. It was for working class families who were paying the full cost of the public housing and their rents. They wanted to defeat it because they thought that public housing was socialistic. The private market should take care of it. Not that the private market was taking care of it, but they thought it was improper for the government to be housing returning war veterans, and so they came up with a strategy that political scientists call a poison pill strategy. I don't know if that means anything to you, but a poison pill strategy is an attempt by opponents of a bill in Congress to get an amendment to the bill passed that is pretty popular, but when it's attached to the bill, it makes the entire bill unpopular. How does it work? Well, the conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act that from now on, all public housing had to be integrated. No more segregation in public housing, no more discrimination in public housing. It was a cynical proposal, but they figured they would vote for it. Northern liberals would vote for it as well. And then when the full housing bill came before Congress as amended with an integration requirement, the conservatives would flip and vote against the integration, the entire bill. Southern Democrats would join with them in voting against the bill because they were all for public housing if it was segregated, but not if it was integrated, and so the bill would go down to defeat. And so Northern liberals campaigned against the integration amendment in 1949. They were led, I'm sure you know this name, they were led by Hubert Humphrey, the leading civil rights advocate in the United States Senate, who led the campaign against the integration amendment in 1949. And they succeeded. Northern liberals voted against the integration amendment. They joined with Southern Democrats in voting against it. Then when the full bill came up to the floor of Congress without the requirement of non-discrimination, both the Northern liberals and the Southern Democrats voted for it, and the bill passed. And that's how we got many of the public housing projects that we know today. The high-rises that were built in places like Chicago and St. Louis, Pruitt-Igoe, you're familiar with that, were built all over the country under the 1949 Housing Act. The federal government used this vote to defeat integration, the requirement for integration in public housing as its excuse, as its justification for continuing to segregate all housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 15 years. And we're getting into pretty recent history. Well, for me, 1949 is pretty recent, but maybe you can understand that the mid-1960s is pretty recent. And the massive projects that I mentioned were built in this way. Well, very soon after the projects were built in the early 1950s, the development occurred simultaneously almost everywhere in the country. It was quite surprising how similarly every community was, but throughout the country, all of a sudden, large numbers of vacancies developed in the white projects, and large numbers, long waiting lists for the black projects. It was surprising because these were all working class families. They all had jobs in the post-war boom. The whites had better jobs than the blacks did, but they were all paying for housing. But somehow, large vacancies in the white projects and long waiting lists in the black projects eventually became so conspicuous and untenable to have projects near each other, one of which had lots of vacancies and the other which had long waiting lists, that all the projects were opened up to African Americans. Soon they became almost all black. That's the situation we know today. And at about the same time, industry left the cities because industry no longer needed to be located near deep water ports or near railroad terminals, because there were highways being built, and so they moved out to suburbs and to rural areas where they could get their raw materials and ship their finished products without being in downtown areas. So there were fewer and fewer jobs available to residents of public housing, who were now almost all black. They became poorer and poorer as a result. Eventually, public housing had to be subsidized. It became a program for poor people. There was such a demand for it that middle-class, working-class families were actually kicked out of public housing if their income was sufficient to rent an apartment in the private market. And public housing became the concentrated poverty communities, slums really. The government ceased maintaining them, ceased investing them once they were all black and once they were subsidized, and it became the kind of public housing that we know today. That's not how it began. But the question that I'm sure you're asking yourself, or I hope you're asking yourself, or maybe if you've read my book already, you are not asking yourself anymore. But the question I asked myself when I read this history of public housing was, why all these vacancies in the white projects? And why long waiting lists in the black projects? And the reason for that was another federal program, which was even more powerful. And that was a program of another federal New Deal agency, the Federal Housing Administration, that began a program to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes in the suburbs. This was a racially explicit program. It was designed, as I say, to suburbanize the white population exclusively into single-family homes in all white suburbs. Before that, if a family wanted to have a single-family home in the suburbs, it would have to buy some land and hire a builder to build a home. Maybe the real risk-taking builder might build 3 or 4 or 5 homes in the same place, but not on a mass scale. And only middle-class families could afford to do something like that. There were very few working-class families living in single-family homes in the suburbs. The Federal Housing Administration resolved to change that. And they recruited a cadre of mass production builders who would build giant suburbs around every metropolitan area in the country. The most famous of these you probably know of is Levittown, east of New York City, but it was in every metropolitan area in the country. The symbol of suburbanization in the 1950s was Los Angeles. Suburbs of Los Angeles like Lakewood, I don't know if you're familiar with these places, Lakewood or Panorama City, or Westchester, west of Los Angeles. All of these were Federal Housing Administration projects for whites only. The way it worked was this: someone like Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place on his own. That's how big Levittown was. Some of these other suburbs were equally large. Maybe some of you remember hearing a song that Pete Seeger sang. Malvina Reynolds wrote it about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all looked the same. This was a giant subdivision, about 15,000 homes built south of San Francisco, an FHA project for whites only. Levitt and the builder of that project, Henry Dolger, could never have assembled the capital to build thousands and thousands of homes in one place. What they did was they went to the Federal Housing Administration and presented their plans for the development. They got the Federal Housing Administration approval for the architectural design of the homes, for the materials that were going to be used, for the layout of the streets, for the setback, and they gave the Federal Housing Administration a required commitment that no homes would be sold to African Americans as a condition of getting the federal guarantee. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and Dolger and the developers of these other suburbs to include a clause in the deed of every home in these subdivisions prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a racially explicit written government policy, nothing de facto about it. The Federal Housing Administration had a manual called the Underwriting Manual, which was distributed to appraisers around the country, tens of thousands of them distributed, because the appraisers were the people who had to approve at the local level the applications of developers to build suburban communities. And the underwriting manual said that any subdivision that was going to be approved had to be for the same racial class, not that any were built for African American racial class, but it had to be for the same racial class. And they couldn't even be built near an African American community because it ran, quote, the danger of infiltration of incompatible racial elements. This is what the Federal Housing Administration manual wrote. In my book, I have a picture. The one developer in Detroit wanted to build a small subdivision for white families only, just like the FHA required, but the FHA thought it was too close to an African American neighborhood. So before it would grant the loan, it required him to build a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long wall, separating, a concrete wall separating his development from the nearby African American neighborhood. And there's a picture of that wall in my book, that FHA-required wall. So the Federal Housing Administration, by this means, suburbanized the white population. The incentive to do this for white families, white working-class families, was so great that they could move out of public housing where they were paying rent and move into an FHA or VA, Veterans Administration, finance subdivision and pay less than their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rent in public housing. The consequences of this are enormous, and they affect the landscape, the racial landscape that we have in this country today. The homes that I'm describing, and this is everywhere in the country, the suburbs I mentioned, and hundreds of them in between, were modest homes. They were for working class families. My uncle was a returning war veteran. He bought a home in Levittown. He stocked vegetables in the supermarket. That was his job. These were not affluent families. These were working class white families. The homes were modest. They were Levittown was 750 square feet. The other subdivisions I've talked about were similar in size. They sold in about 1950 for $9,000 or so a piece. Inflation adjusted in today's money, that's a little bit less than $100,000. So it's a $100,000 home. Any working class family, white or black, could afford to buy a home for $100,000 with an FHA or VA mortgage that required no down payment, and a 30-year mortgage or a 20-year mortgage. Only whites were permitted and encouraged to buy these homes. African Americans were prohibited from doing so and continued to live in rented apartments, either in the private market or in some cases in public housing. Today, those homes in places like Levittown or Daly City, the Little Boxes Place or Lakewood, those homes sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The white families who moved into those homes, the white working class families who moved into those homes, gained over the next few generations, couple of generations. I mean, you can do the arithmetic. You can subtract $100,000 from the current market value of those homes. They gained in equity and wealth, in appreciation, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. Most Americans, except for the very wealthy, have gained what wealth they have from the equity they have in their homes. They don't save much from their incomes. That's not where wealth comes from in this country. Whites gained that kind of wealth. African Americans were prohibited from gaining it. The result is that the white families used the wealth that they gained over the next couple of generations to send their children to college. They used it to weather emergencies. If you've got wealth, you can weather temporary bouts of unemployment. You can't if you don't have wealth. And they used it to bequeath it to their children, who then have down payments for their own homes or their grandchildren, and perpetuated the wealth, the transmission of wealth intergenerationally. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. There's also a big federal role in that disparity, and I have a chapter in the book describing it. I won't go into it now, but the income ratio is about 60%. African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth on average. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. And that determines the racial landscape of this country today. It explains why African Americans can no longer afford to buy homes in suburban communities. In fact, working class families of either race can't afford to buy homes at that price today, but those who have wealth inherited from their parents or grandparents can sometimes do so. The wealth gap not only determines the continued residential segregation on its face, it also, of course, results in the kinds of incidents we had in Ferguson and Milwaukee and St. Paul and other places in the last few years where we've concentrated African Americans in urban communities without access to jobs or transportation, or without access to schools that have high achievement. It also, the reason I got to this investigation was it also determines the achievement gap in schools, where we segregate the most disadvantaged children in single schools. It freezes our social mobility in this country. What economists have demonstrated is that a low-income family, a child from a low-income family who lives in a segregated low-income community is much less likely to have a middle-class income as an adult as a child from an equally low-income family who lives in a less segregated community. So it impedes social mobility in this country. And that, yet, as I said, it's unconstitutional. It's never been remedied. And we've never tried to remedy it. Because of my interest in education, in the course of writing this book, of course, you can imagine, I would look at textbooks. How did high school and middle school textbooks teach this history? And I looked at about a dozen of them. The most commonly used high school textbooks in American schools today, middle school textbooks. I conclude that every one of them, I don't know a good scientific word to describe it, every one of them lies about it. The most commonly used American history textbook in this country, at least as of a couple of years ago when I looked at them, I assume it's still, if it's not the most commonly used, it is one of the most commonly used still. It's called The Americans. It is 1,200 pages long. It has one paragraph in these 1,200 pages that is subheaded Discrimination in the North. It has one sentence about housing, and the sentence reads as follows. In the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. That's it. As you heard in the introduction, I not only wrote this book, I've written other books. I write lots of articles. I know how editors work. They spend a lot of money hiring copy editors to look out for passive voice sentences. And this is one they missed. African Americans woke up one day, they looked out the window and they said, hey, we're in a segregated neighborhood. That's how it happened. And this is a crime. Because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than our generation has learned it, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So one of the things, I do a lot of speaking about this history. It's my mission to educate people about it, but one thing I always tell people is a very simple thing that everybody can do. Everybody has children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews or siblings who are in public schools. They have access to principals and teachers and superintendents and school board members, and we can look into how our schools are teaching this history or misteaching it and insist that it be taught accurately, so that, as I say, the next generation isn't as confused as we've been and misled as we've been about the myth of de facto segregation. Because unless we understand this history, understanding it is not going to correct it on its own, obviously. Every civil rights victory that we've won in the past relied upon a combination of activism and mobilization, sometimes civil disobedience, sometimes marches, as well as understanding. But understanding our constitutional obligation to remedy this is the first step. And so I'm very grateful to you for inviting me here to share this history with you. And I'm glad to engage in a conversation with you and with the rest of you about it. Thank you. Thank you.
And I remember an uncle of mine who bought his farm outside Lima, Ohio, with a farmer's home mortgage after World War II, 35-year fixed rate 1% loan, and other relatives who got Veterans Administration mortgages. And I think that you described that post-World War II dynamic of sort of how a lot of white families got on the wealth-building express train, sort of launching people into multi-generational wealth, whereas people of color were kind of barred from that train. But I think some of the stories even a little bit worse, which is for, say, black families that wanted to buy a home that were excluded by FHA. They were sort of pushed into an older generation of kind of predatory loans or contract for deeds or things that thwarted the building of wealth. And I wonder if there's a piece of that story or a piece of the sort of the parallel narrative of, as whites were getting access to home ownership, what was happening to black families in that period.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. As I said, there are many, many policies the government followed, all of which reinforced each other and interlocked to create the system. And one of them, can I borrow a copy of the book for a second?
Here, I have a couple.
Yeah. Thanks.
I have it.
One of them is a policy, and this is what you're referring to, which is called redlining. The cover of my book is a map of Newark, New Jersey. And the areas that are covered red are the areas where the FHA or the VA would not insure mortgages for African Americans because they were African American neighborhoods. What I was talking about in my initial talk was how it wouldn't permit African Americans to move into suburban white neighborhoods. These are urban neighborhoods that were primarily African American, but the FHA and VA wouldn't insure mortgages for them. People typically think of this as private activity because it was banks that were discriminating. But these maps, there was a map like this of every metropolitan area in the country. They were drawn by the federal government, not by banks. These maps were drawn by a New Deal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And areas were colored red if African Americans lived in them or near them to guide the FHA and the VA into where they should not insure mortgages, and they were used by banks because obviously if they couldn't get FHA or VA insurance, they were much less likely to be willing to make loans. And the result is that African Americans, as you said, had to buy homes on the installment plan, on contract, and gain no equity. And if they missed a payment, they lost everything that they put into it, just like you were going to buy a dress on the installment contract from a store. And in order to make those payments, they had to subdivide their homes to increase their income. They had to double up and with other families. And slums were created as a result from overcrowding. This was all a direct result of government policy. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder, you make a powerful point about how these patterns of residential segregation are harder to address. They're sort of intractable. And I was thinking, many of us here fit the description of helping. We've either been helped by our parents' generation. We got the parental down payment assistance program because our parents, or we're helping the next generation. And I think that's one of the ways in which sort of these patterns can replicate themselves inadvertently. I mean, I think it's sort of like people are just helping the next generation, helping their children. And it kind of reminded me of a colleague of ours, Richard Reeves, who wrote this book, Dream Hoarders, talking about how advantage at the top is sort of reinforcing or compounding and reinforcing these patterns of segregation. And I wonder, as people who are trying to grapple with this, are there examples of inadvertent things that are kind of replicating these patterns? Are there remedies that we can make where we have some agency, where we can make decisions about how to move forward differently?
Yeah, there certainly are. Frequently people say to me that when they read this history, it makes them angry. And I respond to them, it actually makes me hopeful. Because so long as we think it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. If we understand that this racial segregation that we see everywhere around us is not some natural phenomenon, but something that was explicitly created by government racial policy, we can understand that there are policies to reverse it, to undo it. And there are many, many policies, some that are quite easy to implement, that we could employ to desegregate this country. We're not going to do any of them. They're all politically unrealistic. They're not practically unrealistic. They're politically unrealistic because we do not have this understanding. We have a national myth of de facto segregation. We don't have a civil rights movement yet, although it's building. I'm very encouraged by that can base its activity on this history and reverse it. So should I give a couple of examples?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah. Well, one is that once the suburbs were created for whites only, and as the values appreciated in these suburbs, the suburbs adopted zoning ordinances to ensure that nobody could follow the people who moved in there who wasn't wealthy. The zoning ordinances, and there's a chapter in my book which I describe how they were racially motivated initially, but they didn't use race in their words. So suburbs, I don't know if Wellesley is like this, but many suburbs in this country are zoned, or most parts of the suburb are zoned, to exclude townhouses or single-family homes on small lot sizes, or even small apartments, to ensure that no African Americans can live throughout the suburb, and if any area is zoned for multifamily use, it's in a separate area of the suburb where nobody can see them very well. So those zoning ordinances are unconstitutional in my view. They're designed to lock in a segregation that was created explicitly on the basis of race, and they should be abolished. Every suburb should be required, every community, not just suburb, every community should be required to have a zoning that permits a mix of low-income, moderate income, and middle-class housing spread throughout its community. That's one easy reform we could do. At the low end, the federal government now has 3 big housing programs, all of which perpetuate segregation. The biggest one is a subsidy to middle-class homeowners, mostly white. It's called the mortgage interest deduction, and it makes it less expensive for single-family homeowners. And the wealthier you are, the more expensive your home is, the greater the value of the mortgage interest deduction, and the state income tax, the state property tax rather deduction. That's a subsidy that maintains the exclusivity of white communities. At the low end, we have the Section 8 voucher program, which is a subsidy to low-income families that permits them to rent apartments at the median rent in their local housing area without paying more than 30% of their income. And low-income housing tax credit, which is a subsidy, a tax credit given out by the Treasury Department for the construction of homes for low-income families, and both of those reinforce segregation. A Section 8 voucher family is more likely to live in a segregated neighborhood than a family with equally low income who doesn't have a Section 8 voucher, and the reason is that the vouchers can't be used in practical terms in middle-class neighborhoods. Landlords are permitted in most parts of the country I think probably not in Massachusetts, but in most parts of the country, they're permitted to refuse to rent, to discriminate against Section 8 voucher holders. Even though the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination on every other basis, the one form of discrimination that's permitted is you don't have to say, I'm not renting to you because you're black. You can say, I'm not renting to you because you have a subsidy to pay your rent. And that's legal. That can be eliminated. The subsidy itself, which is based on the median rent in a broad area, is, if you think about it from an inch, you realize the median rent is going to be too low to rent in a middle-class community where rents are higher, and too high to rent in an already segregated community where rents are lower, and landlords in low-income segregated communities exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. That could easily be reformed. We could easily adjust, and there is some effort now to do that. We could adjust the formula for creating for Section 8 vouchers so that it incentivized the use of those vouchers in high opportunity communities and not in low opportunity communities. And then the low-income housing tax credit is probably the worst one of all. And there's a whole low-income housing industry which concentrates on developing low-income housing in already low-income segregated communities. Landlords would obviously, who get this tax credit, would obviously prefer to build housing in already low-income segregated communities because the land is cheaper there. And besides, they don't have to hold 55 community meetings to explain why they're building low-income housing in your community. And so there's less trouble to build. But that could very easily be changed. We could simply change the way in which the low-income housing tax credits are awarded, so that they're awarded only to developers who build in high-opportunity communities. So there are many others we can follow as well. I mentioned the mortgage interest deduction in my book. One of the proposals I report on, it's not one I thought up myself, but is to simply withhold the mortgage interest deduction from homeowners in suburbs that refuse to desegregate. They refuse to change their zoning ordinances to permit desegregation. Maybe something less extreme is take those mortgage interest deductions and put them in escrow and return them to the homeowners once their suburb does desegregate, so that there's no permanent penalty involved. So many policies we could follow. Finally, and let me say that here's a radical one, okay? You want a radical one? The things I've described so far are easy. Take the example I gave before about and these are all no cost. Everything I've mentioned so far wouldn't cost the government a cent to remedy this. In fact, if you withhold mortgage interest deduction, the government could make money on desegregating. But here's one that would cost some money, and I described the suburbanization movement. Those homes in the mid-20th century cost $100,000. They now sell for $500,000. The federal government could start buying up some homes at market rates in these suburbs for $500,000 and resell them to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted constitutional remedy for a specific constitutional violation. And it would be completely justifiable constitutionally because it would be based on a history of discrimination. And it could be done. We're not about to do that unless we mobilize a new civil rights movement and an understanding of this history.
Excellent. Let me offer one other question, and then we'll open up. One of the things you point out in the color of law is just as sort of illegal segregation policies, became illegal sort of in the mid-70s, was also the beginning of this period of sort of stagnation of wages, of this kind of period of inequality that we're living through. So really starting in the mid-70s, you have real wages for half the population pretty much staying flat or falling, and that's affecting blacks and Latinos, but it's also affecting a huge segments of working class whites. It's created this interesting political moment. So as we try to face the legacy of residential segregation and the racial wealth divide, we also have this stagnant wage dilemma where a white working class is not feeling like it's sharing in the growth of the economy. So it's a particularly challenging time to talk about the racial legacy when, so I'm just interested in your sort of, how do you think about these two trends? You have a century-long legacy of racism and wealth building alongside a more recent couple decades of growing inequality, growing concentration of wealth, and how that is politically shaping this conversation, this history that we're trying to grapple with.
Well, I would never suggest that racial segregation is the only problem this country faces. There are others that you just mentioned, and we have an economic system which needs reform, cries out for reform. We have growing inequality. But I will say this, that one of the reasons that we have political polarization in this country that prevents us from enacting those kinds of reforms is because we have created a caste system which separates whites from blacks, prevents coalitions from developing, sets whites and blacks against each other. That's a product of the policies that I've described. So certainly segregation isn't the only problem we face, but it exacerbates not only itself, but the other problems we face as well.
Great. One World of Wellesley feature sometimes of these programs is we just want to take a moment for you to just talk to a neighbor just about what is it you're feeling, what is it you're thinking, what reflections do you have. So this is an opportunity to turn to someone, ideally not someone you came with, someone that you might, and introduce yourself and just share. We're just talking about for between 5 minutes total, any thoughts, reflections as you've heard Richard's talk. So let's do that. I'll give you a 1 minute warning. So hopefully that primed you or got your minds thinking of a question that you might have for Richard. So let's hear from you. Any questions? One right here. Yeah.
Well, I noticed that on page 205 there was a discussion of Massachusetts, and that Massachusetts is doing some good things with respect to low-income housing. It's not specifically addressing race, but I just moved here 2 months ago from Montgomery County, Maryland, and that's mentioned on the next page. And my development, the problem is Wellesley is rather built up, but I lived in Montgomery County, and there were new developments being built all the time. And the development I lived in was, I guess, 250 homes when we moved there, but then it was being expanded, and because this law had been passed for the county, that any new development more than 50 units, I think, had to include a certain percentage of moderately priced dwelling units. That's what happened. Our neighborhood got that number of units built.
People back there here? Okay. Yeah, well, this woman has recently moved from Montgomery County, Maryland. Welcome. And in the book, Richard talks about Massachusetts and Maryland doing inclusionary zoning policies that are positive. So, say any more about that? Yeah.
Well, Chuck's right. In the book, Richard talks about inclusionary positive. There's some jurisdictions. New Jersey has what's called a fair share program, which requires every community to move towards having housing for a fair share of its low-income population. It can't be based on race, and none of these programs can be based on race, because at this point, the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, denies that the federal government had anything to do, or state governments had anything to do with creating segregation, so you can't have a remedy for racial discrimination. So the way some communities get around it is by policies that help low-income families move into high opportunity communities. It's an important policy. There are two things I would say about it. One is it's great, but it does nothing to undo the existing segregation. It only applies to new housing, and not every community has as much open space as Montgomery County, so there's not as much opportunity to do it. And the second thing is that we've segregated working class and middle income African Americans as well. Not as much as low income African Americans, but we have middle class African American suburbs because African Americans are not able to buy into white communities, and that needs to be addressed as well. So, but yeah, you're right, those are good programs, and they're a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I was wondering, aside from policies and trying to work with the government, I was wondering what can a group of individuals do? Or more like, aligning with like the corporate America and the gun laws recently that they've addressed. Like if we can't work with the government, what can we do as individuals or through a foundation or something like that?
Well, I gave one example of what everybody can do, and that is see how this is taught in the schools. And I guarantee you, if you make an issue of the curriculum in schools around this topic, you'll start a conversation among the adults as well.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of like, I feel like if like a group of developers got together and they said, we're going to take a look at the city and we're going to build like 6 houses in various locations, whatever. And I don't think that you would passively favor African Americans from buying that home. Correct?
Well, that's correct, yeah. But so long as the zoning regulations exist, you cannot build housing that's affordable for African Americans or anybody in exclusive suburbs, or except in isolated, segregated sections of those suburbs, which is sometimes done. So I don't see how you do it.
Unless the foundation would subsidize it, like a group of wealthy people. You know what I'm saying? They would get together.
But they'd be prohibited by the zoning rules of the community from building housing on small lot sizes or building townhouses. So those zoning ordinances need to be changed, and that has to be done through political action.
Hi, I just wanted to offer a little perspective on the Massachusetts zoning law that you call out as a good start. I happen to work in affordable housing, and that law has been in place for 50 years now, just about, and it's built about 60,000 units of housing, about 30,000 of them affordable. But most of them, I mean, if you look at the segregation patterns in Greater Boston, in Massachusetts, you don't see anything different than what's been described here. And there is a lot of communities, in order to accept a project like that, they require a local preference when you're leasing off that property or selling those units. And the fair housing laws do require an analysis, and the maximum local preference is 70% of the units. But what that does is it keeps the community, I mean, you're meeting the needs of the community, which is good, but it doesn't bring different people into the community. So there's some limits. There is, has been probably for 15 years or more, proposed legislation to require every community in Massachusetts to have multifamily zoning, and that has never been politically viable. And there is a little bit of a chink in that armor right now in a proposal that the governor recently put forth that is actually supported by the Mass Municipal Association, which is really important, which makes it easier for communities to change their own zoning. Because right now you need a supermajority and it will only require a majority. There's some other things the governor's doing, but something you can do is right here in your community, there are a number of redevelopments proposed under that affordable housing law. And you can show up to support it, but you can also maybe try not to have a local preference be included in those properties so that maybe you do get a little more diversity in the community. They're little drops in the bucket, but it's something you can do in the community. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Comments?
Yeah, here and then
Well, I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for reparation by cities or towns partnering with banks to subsidize mortgages for African Americans to go wherever they want to go, but to get them more at the lower rate and subsidize them in some capacity. Because I do think, to your point, it's been unconstitutional. This was put into place. There's reparations in other areas. I mean, the United States has never done that for the African American community, and that's an opportunity. And has that been considered, or is anybody interested in that? Or
Well, I mentioned before, as one of the possible remedies is a subsidy to African Americans to purchase homes that are otherwise unaffordable to them in communities from which they were excluded when they were affordable. It would be terrific if banks and private institutions came up with money to do that, but that's a lot of money, and I don't know that it could reach the scale that's necessary to make a significant dent in the segregation of any community without government funds. But to demonstrate what should be done, that would be a great idea.
But it's not that much money if they're only 10% of the population in the US is black. So if people always estimate it's costing too much, when in reality, the black population in this country is small. But I don't think we put.
Well, I'm not suggesting that we can't afford it. What I'm saying is there's no political support for spending money to desegregate this country, and I'm counting on you to build that support. That's why I'm killing myself going around the country giving these lectures. So,
I was wondering, there's a lot of development going on. Supposedly, they make these deals with developers that percentage is going to be whatever, but there's no teeth to it. So at the end, when they sell it off or whatever, you're right back where you started. What would be a way to actually put teeth to it, to hold people to the original agreement, or what? I don't understand.
well, I don't have a gimmick for you. It requires political will. It requires enforcement of these agreements. And I'm not an expert in Massachusetts law. You know, I have a lot of states to cover. I don't know much about Massachusetts, but if these agreements aren't being followed, there needs to be enforcement, and the only way to do that is by getting an effective political majority to enforce it. I'm giving you cliches, but I don't know any more details about Massachusetts than that.
I have a little thought on that.
Oh, okay, good. I was just going to say, one of the interesting things in Boston is there's now a focus on how do you create permanently affordable housing. And that's sort of the measure of success. So included in that would be public housing, but also nonprofit-owned rental housing, home ownership where there's a sort of resale restriction so that appreciation in land value doesn't push the house. So if we as a community, if Wellesley or any community puts in huge subsidies to create initial affordability, grant money, charitable money, we wave our magic wand and we make that land more dense and allow more density. Anytime we create and invest public resources, we demand that that housing be part of the permanent affordable home ownership or rental market. And so that Boston's now at about 19-20%. And that's good because that means that those residents are not competing in the speculative market for their housing, and we're making better use of our subsidies. So that's an example where, unfortunately, developers in Seattle are going to develop 10 units of affordable home ownership, and they're affordable for the first 5 minutes until they're sold back on the market and lost. So that's what a lot of communities now are getting more sophisticated in saying, if we're going to make that kind of investment, let's lock it up. The other thing, just to the question of money, I'm thinking sort of about what San Francisco did recently. They just put in place a very high-end real estate transfer tax on the transfer of properties over $5 million. So it's very targeted to this huge wealth effect that's distorting our cities right now. And then they dedicated that revenue. Now they've chosen to put that revenue into higher education. There's no reason why you couldn't say a very high-end real estate transfer tax could be dedicated to a fund that provides that access to permanently affordable housing. Like the 40-year, 1% fixed-rate mortgage. You offer enough of those, people are, that was what people were excluded from. Why couldn't we say, well, we excluded people, we didn't offer that 50 years ago, now that's going to be one of the vehicles that will get people into the market. So, back over here. Speak up there.
I've got a two-part question. One is, I'm curious, I know in Harlem in the 80s or 90s there was a situation where apartment buildings, the local people who lived in an apartment, the government was able to allow them to purchase their apartment, and now Harlem is like many people are moving there, and so the community is turned over, but people own their apartments. And I'm curious if that's a common program where instead of having people move to other communities, there was a system where within their community they're able to stay and own their places. So that's one question, part of that question. And in Newark, I noticed that they're building what they call teacher villages and other specialized spaces to redevelop their downtown, but they designated those spaces as for specific groups and populations, whatever. And I'm wondering, is that a new form of trying to create that more integrated community? So that's my wondering part. And my second question is the idea of if the federal government was intentionally creating these spaces that desegregated, when, and you maybe said this and I was not here, when did the government decide, oh, we need to create this policy now to say that housing has to be open and free? When did that transition? Because on every mortgage document and every rental lease, there's that statement that says we cannot discriminate based on color. Was it a lawsuit? Was there a movement? When did this switch over?
In 1968, it was exactly 50 years ago, the Fair Housing Act was passed, which is where the language that you're talking about comes from. It wasn't, there were no enforcement mechanisms added until 1988. So we really didn't have a Fair Housing Act until 1988. But the Fair Housing Act only prohibits future discrimination. It doesn't do anything to undo the rigid patterns that were created by the previous policies I described, and that's why we need aggressive remedies that are equal to the power of the policies that were followed to segregate. But let me say this, and I don't want to take too long in this answer, but you know, in 1866, the 13th Amendment was adopted. 1865, the 13th Amendment was adopted, abolishing slavery. And nobody, I don't think, who supported the 13th Amendment anticipated that the purpose of this amendment was simply to turn slaves into serfs. And Congress in 1866, under the 13th Amendment, passed a law prohibiting discrimination in housing because it understood the 13th Amendment has a Section 2 in it, which requires Congress to pass legislation to implement the 13th Amendment. And Congress in 1866 understood that you couldn't truly emancipate the slaves without making them equal citizens with the right to buy and sell property and rent property. The Supreme Court prohibited Congress from enforcing that law. So actually, it was not 1968 when housing segregation was prohibited. It was 1866. And it wasn't until 1968 that in another case that the Supreme Court recognized, oh, we were wrong back then. 102 years had passed. And nothing was done to rectify the policies that government followed in those 102 years when it was actually unlawful, a violation of the 13th as well as the 14th and 5th Amendments. And we passed a law in 1968 for the bar discrimination going forward without any enforcement mechanisms and added enforcement mechanisms only in 1988.
I was just going to speak to the first part of your question. A lot of jurisdictions have created kind of resident first option to buy laws, particularly in apartment buildings. New York City has homesteading. Washington, D.C., if your apartment building comes up for sale, you and the other residents can get together and have a first right of refusal to buy the building. So it's a recognition in public policy that creating more ownership, resident ownership is a good thing. And the city has a whole support structure to support those resident buyouts. Here in Massachusetts, mobile home parks have a resident first option to buy provision. So it's a property right that expands the possibilities, and then the question is, do you create a support structure? But I think we should be doing more of that kind of thing to enable people who are tenants to purchase the properties they're in when they come up for sale. I think it would have a positive effect. I saw some. Yes, sir. There. Yeah.
You made a reference to Ferguson, Missouri. I was wondering if you could talk about not only zoning laws, but just the division of into smaller and smaller municipal jurisdictions was how that was used as a way of creating segregation and perpetuating it.
Well, I don't know about the smaller jurisdictions part of it, but you know, when Ferguson came into the news because of the killing of Michael Brown by a police officer and the riots that followed afterwards, you know, people asked, how did the suburb become majority African American? We thought African Americans lived in cities. How come this is a suburb? And that happened because of some of the same kinds of policies that the gentleman over there was describing. You know, we call it today gentrification. Back then it was the same policy. We called it urban renewal. And in the early, in the 1970s and 80s and even 60s, the city of St. Louis demolished housing in the African American neighborhood of St. Louis. They built, you know, half of a McDonald's sign to signal the entrance to the west, down the Mississippi River, and they, you know, they built hospitals and universities all on the land that had been occupied by African Americans, and these people were displaced. Where were they going to go? Turns out, of course, they couldn't go any place in the metropolitan area because they were excluded from them, except for one or two communities that had apartment rentals that were available to families who had Section 8 vouchers or were otherwise low income. So the African American population concentrated in Ferguson and a couple of other neighboring communities. The same thing is happening today with gentrification, the kinds of policies that we described before, where a share of housing, even in gentrifying communities, is reserved for low and moderate income families, even if we succeed in doing that. And it's very difficult to do that. But even if we succeed in doing that, that doesn't speak to the majority of families who would be displaced, even if you could just preserve a share of housing for the previous residents. And right now, all across the country, what gentrification is doing, even in places where there are attempts to preserve housing for some of the previous residents, it's simply displacing the existing low-income community to another area, usually a more distant suburb, which is where it's even more difficult to get the jobs than it was previously, because the entire metropolitan areas weren't open. So after the Ferguson riots, for example, the city of St. Louis passed a law prohibiting what I was talking about before, prohibiting discrimination against Section 8 vouchers. That was the big integration reform, saying any landlord in St. Louis had to rent to a Section 8 voucher holder and couldn't discriminate. But it didn't speak to the county of St. Louis, which is where most of the exclusion takes place. So long as we don't do something to desegregate the suburbs, desegregation policy simply within city limits is not going to accomplish much. Accomplish something, I mean, these are all little steps that will accomplish something, but not much.
You mentioned in your book something about President Obama passing an act to, I think, enforce the 1988 Enforcement Act. Is that right? And then that was recently revoked. Could you explain a little bit more about what that is all about?
Well, it's not exactly what I think, but you remember something. I think what I was talking about was that at the end of the Obama administration, they adopted the rule, the administration adopted the rule, refers to the Section 8 voucher problem I was talking about, which allows local housing authorities to increase the amount of voucher for rental in middle-class communities and decrease it for rental in already segregated communities. The Trump administration refused to enforce that rule unlawfully because it was adopted through the regular rulemaking process. The civil rights groups went to court. A local district court ordered the Obama administration, ordered the Trump administration to enforce this rule, and the enforcement order takes effect on April 1st, so we'll see what happens. But it's only a few communities it applies to. It's not a nationwide program.
You had mentioned that what stirred your interest in this area were some a Supreme Court case involving education, where Justice Roberts decided that this was all de facto segregation. You make a fair case for it not being de facto segregation. So one, was any of the information that you have in your book included in the briefs that was submitted there? And two, are you aware of any court cases that might be in the pipeline now in support of desegregation plans where your research might be used?
Well, we actually did have one success. In 2015, the Supreme Court upheld, this is a bit technical, but the Supreme Court upheld the use of the disparate impact standard under the Fair Housing Act, which means that the Supreme Court said that you can, the Department of Housing and Urban Development can find, for example, a low-income housing tax credit program in the state, the kind of thing I was talking about before, violates the Fair Housing Act if it disproportionately places low-income housing tax credits in already segregated communities. And the Supreme Court used this history as one of the bases for saying that this was an appropriate remedy. So there was one success recently along this, but mostly this is not going to happen through court action, because the way our legal system works, nobody would have standing to sue to challenge policies that were implemented 50 or 60 years ago, even though their effects still persist today. So the way this is going to happen is by the adoption of policies. And then somebody will challenge them, and they'll go to court, and the Supreme Court will have to rule on the validity of these policies. So it's not that lawyers won't be involved. They'll still be full employment for civil rights lawyers. It won't come about because an African American living in an urban area cannot go to court and say that if only my great-grandfather had been permitted to buy a home in the suburbs, I would now be a wealthy man. That's not the kind of case you can pursue under our legal system.
Darn.
So I want to go back to the point about gentrification, because that's the thing that resonated with me from just your talk here. And in thinking about it, I cannot really grasp that hope that you talked about, because what I'm thinking about are all of the African American working middle, upper middle class people who were relegated to buying homes in black communities, urban communities, and maintain those homes for generations. And now, but because of policies, are under pressure to not be able to maintain their homesteads. Because the other thing that I know that I've seen experienced in my experiences are the raising of property taxes, like what happened in the South End of Boston and currently in Roxbury and Jamaica Plain and other areas where homeowners who are of color, who don't have those income levels like you talked about because of systemic racism, but they can't manage to take on those extreme property taxes that they put under pressure. So it's just another way in which the system is forcing black people to not be able to own anything and to be wanderers. So I don't know. If you address that in your book, I haven't read the book.
No, I don't address it in my book, but I do know about that problem, and there is a very easy solution to it. It again requires political will and mobilization of civil rights activism to enforce the rights of African Americans and communities like that. But the solution is simple. States could adopt laws that freeze property taxes for existing homeowners, and where the property taxes are increased only at point of sale. Probably a better way to do it. California has such a law. California has something called Prop 13, which freezes property taxes for existing homeowners. The problem with it is that it's destroyed the public school system in California, because it's deprived the system, the schools of revenue. But there's an easy solution to that too. The Prop 13 should be amended so that it continues to freeze property taxes for existing homeowners. But at the point where they sell their homes, the lost property taxes can be recouped. So that, for example, if you have a home that you bought for $100,000 and you're paying property taxes at that assessed value, and you're frozen, and then 15 years later, you sell that home for $600,000, having paid only 1% in property tax increase in property taxes all those years when the property taxes for everybody else have been rising for 5 or 6%. So from that $500,000 profit, the taxes that you didn't have to pay are then recouped by the state, and so the state doesn't lose revenue permanently at the same time that homeowners are protected from increases in property taxes while they own their homes. So instead of making a $500,000 profit on that home, you only make a $475,000 profit. It's like I say, the solutions to all of these are fairly obvious. What we need to do is develop the political will to implement these solutions, and that's only something that you can do.
Ask a follow-up question to that. Like in Massachusetts, we have about 2.5%, so we have something similar. But what would those municipalities do in the schools without the revenue collected to support the schools?
Well, what I'm saying is that they would recoup it at point of sale.
But that could be 30 years.
Well, not everybody. You know, there are constantly sales being made. It would substantially reduce the losses that communities are facing from this kind of freeze in property taxes. It's not everybody who's selling their home at the same point 30 years from now. Every year, there are people always selling their homes, and the money is being recouped and returned. Obviously, the first year you implement this program, it's not going to undo all the damage it's done in the past. It will prevent ongoing damage to the future.
We have time for one more question, comment, last word, anyone?
Well, I'll do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
I have one question I didn't want to ask because I wanted to
All right,
make sure
Michelle.
that everybody.
Oh, all right. Go ahead.
So I don't know, I don't think that I learned this in your book or heard about this in your book, but one of the reasons that, is this what you found in your research, is one of the reasons why governments and the leaders at the time decided that they wanted to create this home ownership for white people. When white people were predominantly renting, was that they were thinking about communism. And they said that, well, if we put white people in homes, then that'll give them more of a security and a base to America owning a piece of land, and they're less likely to become communists.
Well, Michelle, I hate to challenge your memory, but you did read that in my book. In 1918, some geniuses in the Woodrow Wilson administration decided that if they could move urban families into single-family homes in the suburbs, it was an exclusively white program, those workers wouldn't become Bolsheviks like the Russians had become. And during the 1920s, the Harding administration and the Coolidge administration, Herbert Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce in both of those administrations, had a program to propagandize the white population to move into single-family homes. They sent, and this was a very explicit racial program, they actually had community organizers working with the Commerce Department, going to white communities, holding meetings, telling people that the way to avoid racial strife was to move out of the cities and into the suburbs. After I wrote the book, I discovered a poster that the Federal Housing Administration had produced during World War II, which shows a young black man being led away in handcuffs, and the banner is at the top is "Escape Crime, Move to the Suburbs." This is a Federal Housing Administration propaganda. So yeah, this started in the 1920s as a way to prevent communism, and then it became an explicitly racial program, and it was all propaganda until the Federal Housing Administration started to put money into it.
Can you give us the homework that you gave me? Can you tell everyone to look at their deed?
Oh, well, you know, in the book I actually describe this, you know, every home that was built prior to 1950 and many that were built after that probably has one of these clauses in its deeds that prohibit resale to non-whites or rental to non-whites. And one of the things, this is not just for you individually, because it's very expensive. They still exist. You can't change a deed. You know, once the deed is passed on from owner to owner, and it's very expensive for an individual to hire a lawyer to go and have the deed changed. But as a matter of public policy, clerks could be ordered to massively, to systematically remove these clauses from the deeds. And what I suggest instead is instead of simply removing the clauses from the deeds, a clause should be added to the deed saying that we recognize that this home used to have an offensive and inappropriate and shameful language in it, and we want to assert in our deed that we are proud to live in a community that welcomes everybody. And that could be a policy initiative that could be taken by groups like yours.
Wow. I know the town clerk that just got elected. Dr. Casey. So thank you so much. Can we have a huge round of applause for Richard Austin? Thank you so much. And we have also a special thank you to Chuck Collins to come back. Two amazing men doing amazing work that we're very, very grateful for. And thank you to Wellesley Access Cable for filming this event, because I know it's town meeting tonight. So there are a lot of leaders that are making policies and decisions that need to see this. So I will be sending it to them. Hello. So thank you so much for everyone for coming to this great event. World of Wellesley is so excited to be able to sponsor these events. Thank you to the Wellesley Community Center, who allows us to use the space for free. You know that Wellesley, a very prime location for space, and to be able to have a beautiful space like this. We are very thankful for Steve and the Community Center here. So please, again, Betsy Camiotti actually called me today and asked me to recommend, she is my friend and also president of the Friends of Wellesley Metco, which is a fundraising arm for Wellesley Metco, which I definitely look into if you don't know anything about that. But she suggested that we buy up all of Richard's books for sure, and Chuck's, and share them. And maybe take your own book that you've read, either donate it to your library, if Wellesley Public Library, I don't know if Wellesley Public Library has a few copies, but also give it to a neighbor, and then maybe have them pay it forward, give it to someone else, and we continue to share the book, and then maybe we pass it around for a year, get 10 people reading it, and then we all gather together and have a conversation and try to figure out what policies we can affect. So thank you, Betsy, for this suggestion. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a very safe evening, and thank you.